We are going to go on a guided tour, and our park ranger is Heather, and she said we could video, so here we go.
How many of you, is this your first visit to George Washington Carver? All right, welcome. Well, you picked a great day to come. Today's our special celebration, with it being Carver Days, and we are celebrating our 81st year as a national park.
Wow.
And this is for a very, very special individual, and I look forward to sharing with you the story. This is his birthplace, and today as we're walking through, we're going to be talking a lot about that. Now, real quick before we head out on the trail, I want to talk a little safety. It is quite warm today. I want to make sure that you all are taking care of yourself. I see some of you having drinks. That's great. Also, we want to make sure that you stay on the trail at all times. We do have plants off to the side that you could get into burrs. You also could get into ticks or chiggers, but also snakes, right? We may see some wildlife today. I'll point it out and we can celebrate it together. Of course, I'll be in the front, so if it's a snake or something like that, I'll be sure to point it out. Okay, and I am delighted to be here with you all. I actually came here, I joined on staff in April, so this is a new park for me, but I have always loved the story of George Washington Carver. So if you're ready to go explore, we'll head out. Let's go. I want to make sure y'all can hear me okay, so I'll come off the trail here and come into the grass. So, you know, we became a national park in 1943, 6 months after George Washington Carver passed away. That is really significant, 1943. This is the very first national park that was named for an individual other than a president. And it was named for a black man in a time of segregation still. So to me, it gives me chills every time I say that. That was a really big deal. Now, it took about 10 years until we opened up fully. They had to acquire the land, and we opened up in 1953. Things would have looked very, very different here in George Washington Carver's time. Now, this is a restored prairie here. There would have been farmland here. There would have been this forest here. And I can't wait to get inside to the woods with you because it's very magical. Before we start our story, though, we need to step back into time. And in 1821, Missouri became a state, along with another state, and that state was Maine. In order to keep the balance, we had to have a slave state and a free state. Missouri was the slave state. People started hearing that this was an ideal place to come settle down. It was great for farmland, it was great for agriculture, it was great to have a homestead. And as we get into the woods, you're going to see spring-fed creek there. It was a water source that we had here. So Moses Carver and Susan, along with some of Moses's brothers, they loaded up everything they owned on wagons and traveled here. Now, one by one, Moses's brothers passed on. But before they passed on, they purchased 240 acres here. Right? So let's walk ahead a little ways and we're going to continue to talk more. All right. So I mentioned that George Washington Carver National Monument became part of the National Park Services in 1943. Now, this was placed here in 1953 when we became a national park. I stop here and point this out because this rock, I'm going to reference this rock a couple times to you. All right? So we're going to move forward. Did anybody have any questions or curiosities before we move forward? Well, or you can just stand around.
Might not get up.
You guys can sit on the wall, or we can all just stand around. So I mentioned to you that Moses and Susan Carver and some of Moses's brothers, they traveled here. They purchased this 240 acres of land here. And the thing is that Moses and Susan Carver, they were not in favor of slavery. Now, I will share with you before we start talking, we may talk about some things that are really sad, might be very difficult to hear, but it's important that we share our story, okay? Yeah. It does end much happier, though, I will share with you, okay? So, Moses and Susan Carver, they purchased this land here along with the brothers. They were not in favor of slavery, But they ran into a problem, and I have to ask myself a question: how in favor of slavery were they, or were they not? Because they made a decision to purchase a 13-year-old girl. Her name was Mary. They needed help on the farm. And so they purchased another human being. It was 1855. Here's her bill of sale. It's like a receipt that you get when you go to the grocery store. And this was for another human being. How old are you guys?
I'm 13.
You're 13. You're 4. Right. So you're 13 years old. So Mary was the same age as you. How would you feel if you were told that you couldn't be with your family anymore?
Depends on the day.
He's
got to think about it.
Is that original?
This is a picture of the original, yes. Right there.
I read that.
I know. She needed a place to live. And you know what? We're standing in the very place where she lived. And there would have been a very small slave cabin right here. There would have been another cabin where Moses and Susan lived up by that rock there. And that rock will come more into our story as we go ahead. And so young 13-year-old Mary, she was living here. Now how do I know that? Well, when we became a national park, they were curious about where could George Washington Carver's birthplace be. So they came here, they started digging, and they started to find things like right where your feet are. This was a hearth. They found ashes right here. They found broken pieces of pottery. They even found marbles. Have you seen the marbles in the visitor center yet? Not yet. Well, yeah, you did, yeah. So they found that. So that led them to believe that this was the birthplace. So Mary went on to go and have 2 children, Jim and George. Jim was first. So little George was born, and it was during the time of the Civil War. And things were very, very difficult. And because he was born enslaved, they didn't even hear what his birthday was. They never wrote his birthday down. Can you believe that? Oh. You know, do you all know when your birthday is? Yeah, it's important to us,
We
right?
all hear it all the time.
Yeah. So, but we didn't know. So, the Civil War is going on. There were these people called bushwhackers. They were all about coming in and stealing people's property. And that's what they did. They came here and they actually kidnapped George and his mother, Mary. And they took him down to Arkansas. Now, George was a very, very young baby. And from there, a lot of things were happening. Moses Carver wanted his property back, so he hired a local man. He promised them some money and a racehorse if he goes down and gets George and Mary and brings them back. So the guy goes down to Arkansas, and he actually could not find Mary. And he had been told she died. He had been told that she had been sold off. Some people reported that they saw her marching off with soldiers. George never saw his mother. Now, what I forgot to mention was that George's father, who lived on another farm nearby, he was an enslaved individual as well. He died in a logging accident and never had a chance to meet George. So from there, this man, he brings young George back without his mother. He truly is an orphan. All he has is his brother Jim. And so they bring him back here. Now Moses and Susan Carver, they didn't have any children of their own. And so they made a decision that they were going to help bring him up. And this had to be very, very hard because it was their property. It was, I can't tell you what they felt. I can't tell you if they cared or if they were nurturing. I don't have a lot of information on that, right? George has mentioned a few things, but we just don't know. But they raised them up. The Civil War ends. One thing I didn't mention was that George had a really, really bad case of whooping cough, and he almost died. When he was first brought back here, they brought in the doctors, and they thought that he would die. And they weren't even sure he was going to make it. And they said, well, if he lives, he's not going to live past 20 years of age. So, and that will come into our story towards the end. So, they raise him up, and young George ends up doing different things than his brother, and we'll talk about that at our next stop. But any questions or any curiosities about that story so far? How did that make you feel as we talk about that?
We're going down the Carver Trail into the woods that George Washington Carver grew up in and around. Not exactly the same foliage and stuff, but still, magical place. Oh, I unplugged.
No, I should have up there this is a drawing of the cabin that George Washington Carver drew. Turn around, look at that. When we were sitting there, right? This is a drawing that he did.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, and you can see this also in the visitor center. Isn't that amazing? But here's the thing, him and his brother would have lived in it. It had no windows. Imagine on a hot day like today when you still had to have your fires going, right? Or in the wintertime, it probably was pretty cold. And the size of that cabin was so small, it's the size of some of our bedrooms, right? Can you imagine that?
No.
No. So, remember how I told you George Washington Carver had whooping cough and we thought he was going to die, right? So that kind of changed the course of his life because Moses and Susan Carver, they made a decision. Jim was to help out in the fields with Moses, and George was going to stay and help Susan in the house. So he helped with chores around the house. He actually would help with the laundry, help with collecting water for laundry and for drinking. And this is the very spot where he would come down from this spring-fed stream here to collect water. Now my question is to you, it's pretty clear. Would you go up and take a big gulp of water out of there?
No,
No.
not now.
Not now, right? Did you notice all the farm animals as we drove in today, right? That's all getting into that water table. Now back in the day, this would have been the ideal place because it was a fresh water source. They didn't have a way to purify their water. This was a good source. So George got to the point where he really connected with nature from these times coming into the woods. And when he had free time, he actually would ask to come into the woods and spend his time in the streams collecting flowers, collecting plants. One of the things that he did was that he helped Susan Carver with her plants. And he ultimately got the name the Plant Doctor. So pretty interesting story. And it's kind of a clue to what we're going to talk about at our next stop. But any questions or any curiosities? All right. He connected with the great creator in these woods. And he was a very young child. I see your hand up.
How far do you think it is from here to like the cabin?
The cabin, it's going to be right up. See where the clearing is here? Yeah. It's just right up there. It's not very far. But it probably wouldn't have had a nice path like we had today, right?
Like, was there ever like a path here?
You know, I don't know. I mean, if you've ever walked sometimes over back and forth the same area, you kind of make a path. So I assume George had a way to get down here.
Or like a dirt?
Yeah, exactly.
So he was self-educated then up to that point, correct?
And the kid goes, look, teacher, there's a snake in the tree. The teacher kind of scared him.
This is the water part that she was talking about just a minute ago, that he would come down.
So this is a bronze statue of young George Washington Carver. Actually, the park placed it here in the 1960s. We call this the bronze statue. How old do you think he is here? 10?
11, 9,
Okay, so right in there.
12.
Yeah, I tell people this is a young George Washington Carver between the ages of 10 and 12. You know, again, it's one of those things we just don't know. This is the artist's inspiration. But what is young George holding here?
Plant.
Plant, right? I used to think a flower, right? But then I was like, oh wait, he's the plant doctor, or you know, or a bird at first.
It looks like a fish because like it
Yeah.
looks like the
Tail of the
Tail of it, yeah. And you know, it's what we see, but the thing is it actually is a plant. See the roots right down here? Now, remember how I was telling you that young George, he was really interested in plants, and when he spent time in these woods, he would go and he would collect plants that he saw, and he would carefully dig them up, and roots and all, he would move them to a location and replant them. He created a beautiful, beautiful garden, and it was a secret garden. And the reason why it was secret, he told people about it, but he never told anyone where it was. So we don't know. He also would collect rocks. I've been told that he placed rocks around his garden. Again, I don't know if this is entirely true, but he placed rocks around his garden. And one day he was out doing an errand, and he went into someone's home, and he happened to see a beautiful painting. It was vibrant, it was beautiful colors like he had never seen before. And he got an idea that he wanted to try his hand at painting. So he started collecting his plants, his berries, his flowers, and he started grinding them up to make those paint colors to paint his rocks. Think about that. We're going to talk more about what he did later in his life, but remember that he was collecting those plants to make paint. So I see you have your hand up. What's your question?
He wanted to
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And that inspired him. It inspired him to come back. And I'll get your questions in just a moment, okay? They are great questions. I appreciate them too. So let's talk more. So young George, he was really curious about the world around him. And this was a time period of when the Civil War ended, and we entered into a time period of segregation. Now, segregation rhymes with separation, right? What it meant was that black and white students, they couldn't go to school together. You weren't able to drink from the same water fountains. You weren't able to stay in the same places. Couldn't share a meal. You couldn't eat out, right? Exactly. So there was a school right down the street that was just 1 mile away, and George couldn't go, all because he was black. So Moses and Susan Carver, you know, I've heard different things. Susan had a blue book speller. I've heard that they brought in the teacher from this local school down the way and tutored George, taught him how to read this book. And he was so smart that he mastered the whole entire book, and he wanted more. So, young George told Moses and Susan Carver, because he was no longer enslaved, that he wanted an education, and he left. And he traveled 8 miles down to Neosho, where there was a school for other black children, and he could go to school. Now, how would you feel about traveling 8 miles by yourself, about 10 to 12 years of age? Would you be fine? Some people think absolutely. Well, that's where I was going with this. This was a time of segregation. He would have been traveling through people's land, right? He would not have probably been welcomed there. So, young George, between the ages of 10 and 12, he travels to Neosho for this education. And he gets there, and he decides he needs somewhere to stay, doesn't know what to do. So, he actually, there was a barn right near the school. He went into the barn, and he spent the night. And from there, the next morning, a woman named Mariah Watkins, her and her husband owned that barn and home area. And she opened up the barn and said, "What are you doing in my barn?" And he said, "I came here. I needed a place to sleep. I'm here to go to school next door." And she said, "Well, that's fine and all, but you can't stay here in the barn. But if you help my husband, Andrew, and I, you can come into the home." So they invited him in. She gets the nickname Aunt Mariah. Now, Aunt Mariah, she learned how to read and write. She was born enslaved as well, and she encouraged George to get this education. So George starts school, and in fact, he drew this beautiful drawing right here, right? This is of the house and the school. He was a really good artist. I'm going to show you some more art in a little bit. Can you see
So
it
which
back
one's the
there?
school?
Well, I wonder that myself. My sense is it's probably this.
Well, there's like a building in the back, so that. So
Right, so I
Yeah.
think that's just something else.
That might be their
That that might be
Yeah.
the barn, and then the school. Yeah.
Absolutely, right. You know,
perspective of
there is. Exactly, that's really good observations. Can you all see? Can you see back there? You're good. So, young George, he's there, he's studying, he's working hard, he's helping Aunt Mariah. Now, Aunt Mariah, she was the local midwife and medicine woman. She would collect a lot of plants to help for medicinal reasons. And again, that is fostering more information and encouragement into George about these plants, right? Curiosities. So George is studying, and the teacher that was there had only learned how to read and write just a number of years before. So George learned everything that this man could possibly teach him. So Aunt Mariah encouraged, there was a family leaving. They were headed to Fort Scott, Kansas, which was about 80 miles away. And they had everything they owned in this wagon. So George had to walk most of the way. Can you imagine that? 80 miles. We were just talking about 8 miles, but he had to go 80 miles. He wanted that education. So he traveled to Fort Scott, Kansas, but he wasn't there for very long because something really awful happened. Yes, he saw a black man tortured, and he got very, very scared and said he didn't feel safe to stay here. So he left, and he went on an educational journey. That thirst for knowledge kept him searching, kept him wanting more. So he traveled to Olathe, Paola, Minneapolis, Kansas, where he ultimately graduated high school. But he wasn't done yet, right? He was super excited. He wanted to go to college. So he applied to a place called Highland College, and he was thrilled. He got in, and he showed up on the first day of school, and he had that letter in his hand. He was proud. And somebody walked up to him and said, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here." Why do you think he wasn't? Why do you think that? Also, homesteading, having agriculture and animals. However, it just wasn't enough for him, right? And he made a decision through friends who encouraged him to apply to Simpson College. Now this is where the story gets really neat. He was a great artist. Remember how I told you? In fact, he entered painting into the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Expedition, and he was so talented he won an honorable mention. And here's a picture of that right here. And you might see this upstairs in the visitor center.
Is the original here?
No, I don't believe so, but you'll see a nice picture. It'll be a big picture. Can you see it back there? So he decided to go to Simpson College to study art, and he was really good, right? He was always drawing pictures of plants and flowers, and his teacher, Miss Etta Budd, she thought he was a great artist, but she was very, very concerned. She was afraid that he wasn't going to be able to make money as an artist. It would have been very, very hard. So she said, you know, my father teaches at what we call now Iowa State University, right? And so he decided to go to Iowa. He applied, he went to Iowa State University. He majored in agriculture, right? He got his bachelor's degree, then his master's degree. And he was so good at what he did that they asked him to stay on and teach. But before he left, remember I started talking about that school in Neosho, it's 8 miles from here. Aunt Mariah asked him to make a promise that when you get all this education, that you be sure to go back and help your people. And that's what he did. He didn't stay at Iowa State University. About this. So you remember that big rock I told you about? So in the 1880s, well after the time that George had left here, a tornado had come through and destroyed the 2 cabins, the one that George was born in and the one that Moses and Susan Carver lived in. So that tornado, they needed a place to live. So Moses decided he was going to build a house, and he built this very house, but not here. He built it up by the rock. It was only until after Moses passed that the new owners moved this house here. They picked up the entire house, one whole piece, and brought it here. I don't know how.
What year was that?
So in the 1880s, they built this home. But let's talk more about this house. Now obviously, it's made of wood. Not everything is going to last, right? So me being a park ranger, and all of us who work for the National Park Service, we're responsible for protecting and preserving these special places. And in some cases like this, the roof has been replaced. The Park Service brought in people who specialize in called historic preservation, and they're able to come in and they replace this roof to make it how it was during the time that Moses built this house in the 1880s. So though it's not original, it is very historic looking. Now there are some things like the floors that when we go in, we're not sure, they're not sure entirely if the floors are original or not. They lean towards them being replaced, right? And we also, I'm sorry?
I said, y'all get out of our front yard. Go on down the road.
Okay.
He's stressing us
Don't
out.
want any.
All right.
These neighbors,
I know, right? Well, be
oh
careful.
boy.
Yeah.
You know, I think there are a few ghosts in there. Don't open that one closet door.
Okay, we
I
won't.
heard sounds coming from in there.
All right, well, if you guys are ready, let's walk inside the house, okay?
The roof she's talking about. I have to be careful because there's kids here and I don't want them on our video. I already told their mom guardian that we wouldn't do that. So, but this is the roof and now we're going to go inside. It might be a little too dark, so we'll see you on the outside. Lightning.
Ahead, and we're going to talk more, but one thing I want to talk about, when he went to Tuskegee, he had to be very resourceful. There are stories that he went to the trash dump to collect, to build up his lab, right? Look at that. There's in the visitor center and seen the lab up there.
They made peanut milk.
They made peanut milk. Okay, so that's a replica of his lab at Tuskegee University, and it was much nicer than when he would have first started, because he had to go and collect whatever he could, but he was being resourceful, using the things that he had. Here is a picture of George Washington Carver with some of his paint swatches, and he was into chemistry. He was really curious about taking clay and soils and things to make paint pigments, to help people put coloring into their homes or other options. Over 500 different colors. Isn't that amazing? Truly amazing. Now, you all made peanut milk today. He made over 300 recipes made from peanuts. So here's a question I have for you. True or false? Okay? Did George Washington Carver invent peanut butter?
No.
True. All right, raise your hand if you think George Washington Carver invented peanut butter. Okay. He did not. He did not, but he did have a recipe. And I think that that's really important to know. And if we could just step forward, we have some people behind. He invented a recipe. He had over 300 recipes, including that peanut milk recipe, right? Which went on to help people over in Africa as well. So I think that's pretty amazing. So we do talk about those younger years here, but I really want to showcase those important later years in life, because George Washington Carver was an amazing humanitarian, a scientist, and he helped all people. So we're going to continue to move forward. Nature, it was an opportunity to connect with a great creator, and that's where he got his inspiration, spending time in nature. I can relate to that. I feel a connection every time I'm on a trail or I'm in the woods, feeling it just brings me peace and joy. And for George, it brought him inspiration as well. So as we walk up the hill here, we're going to make our next stop up ahead, but on the right-hand side, you're going to see more walnut trees. What's interesting is those used to be a persimmon tree right through there, several trees. For whatever reason, we have walnut today. Do y'all know what persimmons are?
No.
No. They don't smell very good when they're rotting on the ground, but apparently they make really good pie. It is a type of fruit that comes from a tree. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
I heard a lot of locusts on the other side.
George Washington Carver spent his entire career at Tuskegee Institute, his entire time there. And he had a connection. He did many great things for all walks of life, black and white. And George Washington Carver, he passed away, and he's actually buried there. He passed away on January 5th, 1943. He is not buried here. And I mention that because we're standing next to the Carver Cemetery here. Now, we don't have much information about this cemetery. I'll start off by telling you this rock wall here. Moses put a rock wall around it originally to keep the livestock out. And then when we became a national park, the national park built it back up. But we had historic preservationists come in a few years back to build it up by the way it might have looked when Moses and Susan Carver were here. Now, like I said, George is not buried here, and his brother Jim, who died about the age of 25 from smallpox when he was in Seneca, Missouri, he actually passed away and is buried there. Now here, Moses and Susan Carver are buried. His niece, Sarah Williams, and her husband, William Williams, and a number of family members are buried here. Now, Now, if you're okay with it and you want to follow me into the cemetery, we can see those graves. I'll show you a couple other things. But first, I want to share with you, there are headstones. These are going to be the taller stones, right? And in front of those headstones are going to be small stones. Those are called footstones. So the person who's passed away, their head is by the big stone and their feet are by the little stones. We are going to walk single file where you can follow me through because we do not want to walk over the graves. But I'm going to stop at Moses and Susan Carver's because I want to show you something that's written on Moses's tombstone. All right, let's move forward. So right here, Moses and Susan are buried, and then right next to them is William Williams and Sarah Williams. Now something interesting I noticed the other day, and I'm going to read it to you. This is on Moses's tombstone. Friends and strangers, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, you will be. Prepare for death to follow me. I think that stops me in my tracks. He had no idea that we would pass by this tombstone every single day and see this here. And he is an important part of our story. He was George Washington Carver's enslaver, right? And this was his home with his wife and his niece and her husband. A number of his family members are buried in here. Some people that are not family members in the community are buried here. And I'm just going to take you on a short little stop, and we're going to stop in one place because I want you to look at these 4 tombstones and see what they have in common, okay? So be careful, follow where I walk. Now I will share with you there could be people buried outside these walls. We just don't know. There's a lot that we don't know. Everybody comes here, but look at these 4 tombstones.
Oh, look at that pretty little flower there.
So what are you all noticing about these tombstones?
Well, it's all the same children.
They're young children, 4 years, 10 months, 5 years, 2 years, 2 years. I'm sorry?
Was there a disease?
Well, that's where I was going to go. Because there was, you know, it was hard living off the land during this time period in rural America, right? But then we also, and we can all relate to this, we've just come through a pandemic. Tuberculosis and smallpox were rampant at this time, and there were no cures at this time. And I will share with you, many people think that tuberculosis, there's a cure. But in fact, my son, who I brought home from Belarus, had tuberculosis. So we have a cure today, but it's very much something that still exists today. I don't know what happened with this family, but something very tragic did.
They're just going to be
All right, we are going to move to our next stop. Now, one other thing I will share with you, there is a George Carver buried in here, but it's not George Washington Carver, right? It was Moses' brother. And George Washington Carver had the name George Carver, so possibly named after the brother, I'm not entirely sure. But it was just something else I wanted to point out. Somebody had mentioned that. All right, let's move forward. Wrinkles, face, mustache, okay. Well, this was placed here when we finally opened up in 1953. This is called a bust, and this definitely is an older George. And I love this stop, though, because he has a poem that he recites. It's one of the last things we have recorded of him. He actually spoke at Selma University shortly before his death, and he read in a poem that is called Equipment. Now, he did not write this poem, but if you listen to it, you almost feel like he did, right? It is really a neat poem. It's very inspiring. So see what you can hear, and see, I'm going to ask you what he said when we got done. Now, when I hit play, first there's going to be a narrator, and then he's going to read the poem. Remember I told you he had whooping cough? His voice is going to sound very, very high-pitched because his vocal cords were damaged, and so it changed his voice.
The land about us here, with an abundance of streams, woodlands, fields, and wildlife, provided young George with his first schooling and instilled within him a deep love of nature. a belief in God's universal design and the power of individuals to control their destiny. This philosophy, developed during the endless wanderings of a young child through forests and meadows, is expressed by Carver himself during his closing remarks at the 59th commencement address at Selma University in 1942.
I close with this bit of poetry, author unknown, entitled Equipment. Figure it out for yourself, my lad. You've all that the greatest of men have had. 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and a brain to use if you would be wise. With this equipment they all began. So start to the top and say, I can. Look them over the wise and great. They take their food from the commonplace. And similar knives and forks they use, with similar laces to tie their shoes. The world considers them brave and smart, but you've all they had when they made their start. You can triumph and come to skill. You can be great if you only will. You're well equipped for what fight you choose. You've legs and arms and a brain to use. And the man who has risen great deeds to do began his life with no more than you. You are the handicap you must face. You are the one who must choose your place. You must say where you want to go, how much you will study the truth to know. God has equipped you for life, but he lets you to decide what you want to be. Courage must come from the soul within. The man must furnish the will to win. So figure it out for yourself, my lad. You are born with all that the great have had. With your equipment, they all began. Get hold of yourself and say, I can.
What was George? Celebrate this man and let us all make a difference, and let's all use our courage for good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Round of applause.
And we are done. See you next time. Thanks for sharing your day with Butler Family Farm.